I'm a 24-year-old male, and this happened to me a few years ago when I was around 21. I remember because it was shortly after my birthday in December. It was really cold outside and there was snow on the ground as we had just had a snowstorm pass through our area. I lived with my parents at the time, and my mom is not really a fan of driving in the snow, so she asked me if I could drive her to the gas station for her to pick up some cigarettes for her and my dad, as well as a few other items they might have needed. I said sure, as I wasn't really doing anything at the time, and I grabbed my keys, then following her to the car. I remember the cold air hitting your face pretty hard that night, so it had to be at least around the teens, which made the snow and whatever else was on the roads really slippery. This is important to know for later on in the story. The nearest gas station was about 5 minutes away from us, but given the conditions of the roads, it took us about 10 to get there. Once I was able to park the car, my mom got out of the car, then made her way inside the store. From where I was parked, I could see her inside the store standing in the line that was leading up to the register. I kept the car running as it was really cold and I just didn't want to be sitting in the car without any heat. I was browsing on my phone while waiting for my mom to get done, and right around that time I had seen her finally approach the register. There was a black truck that pulled up into the parking spot right next to my car. I found this a bit unusual given that the parking lot was empty, so there was really no reason for them to park right next to the spot where I was. But I kinda just chalked it up to them wanting to be as close to the entrance as they could, given how cold it was that night. No one got out of the car at first, but I didn't even notice this until I looked up to see my mom walking out of the entrance back to the car. I glanced over to the truck's passenger side window, and I could just make out a figure sitting in the passenger seat, and they were facing in my direction. My mom opened the door, then got inside, before then asking me what I was looking at. I told her about the truck pulling up well over a few minutes ago around the same time that she approached the register, but that nobody had gotten out. She first chalked it up to maybe they were just waiting for someone inside the store to come out, but when I mentioned seeing a figure in the passenger side of the car looking towards our direction, she then began to sense why I was so spooked out by it. She told me to just back out and get out of there, and that we didn't need to worry about them once we drove off. As soon as I put the car into reverse and then began to back up, the passenger door swung open and hit the side of my car. A tall, very built man stepped out from the car as soon as the door made contact with my car. I hit the brakes as soon as I felt the contact, and the man stood there before throwing his hands up at me and then staring in my direction. I didn't really know what to do as I'd never really been in any sort of accident before, and my mom was sitting right there next to me and could see as well as I had that the door had not been opened until we had already started moving. The man slowly walked up to my window and just stood there. I cracked it very slowly, and I told the man that I was sorry, but that I didn't see the door open as I was backing out. For a brief moment, he didn't really say anything. That is, before he simply asked,
"Roll down your window a little bit more. I can barely hear you."
I knew this couldn't be true as it was really quiet in that area, and I wasn't even speaking in a low tone. I told him that I'd prefer to keep it cracked as I really didn't want to let cold air get into the car. This really angered the man, and he immediately spoke in a more angered tone now. He was telling me to roll down my window yet again. I again told him no, and this is when things then took a turn for the absolute worse. Without any warning whatsoever, the man smacked my window really hard with his hand. Startled, I immediately jumped back and rolled the window up. My mom was right beside me, just absolutely yelling for me to just back out and leave, but I was really afraid of hitting the man in the process as he was still right next to my car. The man kept smacking my window really hard a few more times before he then tried punching it. It was right at this point where I realized that if I didn't get my mom and I out of there fast, this guy was definitely going to hurt us. I could see the cashier inside the gas station heard what was going on, and he looked to be on the phone with what I could only assume was the police. But there was absolutely no way I could wait for them as the man was now both punching at my window and now kicking my door. It was like some switch had then flipped on in this man's head, and he had just totally lost it. I told my mom to hold on as I put the car into reverse again and backed out of there as fast as I could, just barely missing the guy by a few inches. I pulled fully out of the parking spot before the man ran out in front of our car and slammed his hands right on the hood. I sat there frozen, not knowing what to do, as the man looked right back at me. I turned the car wheel, then sped around him, trying to avoid him the best that I could before booking it the hell out of there. After that, I honestly thought that was the end of it. But as we made our way down the road to a stoplight, I was able to see headlights that was fast approaching from behind our car. And once it was close enough behind us, I could then see that it was the same truck the man was in. There appeared to be 2 people inside of it. I assumed the man I encountered must have been the passenger, and I guess the driver was someone I hadn't noticed before. I told my mom that it was them behind us, and she started to freak out and call my dad, then letting him know what was going on. We were still probably about 10 minutes away from our house given the road conditions, but I knew that there was no way that I could get us back to our house in that amount of time before these guys tried to ram us off the road, or whatever else they had planned for us. My dad told my mom for us to attempt to head back towards our house and that he would try and meet us halfway in his truck. She told me this, and I agreed that this had to be our best option, given that I couldn't turn around and head back to the gas station still not knowing if the police had even been called or not. So once the light turned green, I punched on the gas and sped off. I'm gonna be completely honest. I really wasn't being that cautious of the road at this point, as there really weren't any other cars at this point of the night. There were a few times where the car slid from the ice on the road, and I knew that it would only take one turn of the wheel to lose control, but I wasn't going to slow down and let these guys catch up to us. After about a few minutes of driving, we were able to see headlights right in front of us on the other side of the road. I was thinking that it had to be my father, and as we got a little closer, we were able to make out his truck beyond the lights. Very surprisingly, the truck was still behind us, still keeping pace with me given the road conditions. I could see my father cut across a midsection of the roads and then stop shortly off the side of the road. I started to slow down right as we approached and then pulled off to the side of the road, the truck still following me. As I came to a stop, the same man from before that was in the passenger seat hopped out of the car, then started making his way to our car. The driver opened his door, but before he could step out, both of the men stopped dead in their tracks at the sound of my father's voice. I suggest that both of you hop back in that car and drive right on out of here before I put a bullet in the both of you. I could see my dad walking out into the light, radiating from both his and my headlights. He had his 9mm pistol pulled and aimed right at the man's head as he stood right next to my car. I pretty much just watched as both of the men just stood there for a brief moment as my dad slowly inched his way towards them. The man then very slowly backed away towards his truck before then speaking to what I assumed was my father.
"You're really lucky you got here when you did."
The man laughed and jumped back into his truck before it quickly backed out and drove off in the other direction. My dad walked to my window and he asked me and my mom if we were okay. I remember telling him that other than being scared shitless, I think we were fine. Shortly afterwards, my dad followed us back home just to make sure no one else followed us. I really have no idea what those men's intentions were or why the man acted the way he did. All I know is that if I hadn't reacted how I did to get my mom and I out of there, I just really hate to think what those men would have done to us. Sometimes you need a bit of fun in your life, and certain people can definitely make it brighter. I'm talking about friends. Close friends. This story's been in the back of my mind for about 2 years now, and it's one of the most terrifying experiences of my entire life that I really want to forget. It occasionally pops into my mind, and it still gives me the shivers to this day. It was the end of another school week, a Friday, and as a lot of us teenagers do, we decided to have a sleepover on the weekend. My friends agreed with me, and we happily walked home, talking about what we should do the next day and where we should go, and all that stuff that you'd expect to talk about. One of my other friends said that we should have a sleepover at his place. I'm not revealing their real names for privacy reasons, so for this story I'll call them X and L. And in case you're confused, it was X that said he wanted us to sleep over at his place. I quietly walked home as I and Elle split up to go to our own houses to pack up our belongings for the sleepover. I grabbed out my bathroom equipment, sleeping bag, and fresh clothes, and all the other stuff you would need for a sleepover. Once I was finished packing my bag, I had called both X and L on our group chat, and told X that I had packed and I'd asked my parents if I was allowed to come, and told them they said yes, and L said the same thing as me. We were all excited, and X said that he'll be waiting at the park down outside his house to meet, since the park was only 2 houses down from his place. I casually walked to the park, which was approximately 10 minutes away. Right as we got there, I saw X and L already at the park. I gave them both a wave and we all walked to X's house. We all got inside and made ourselves comfortable with our sleeping bags in the living room, because X's room was, well, a tad bit tiny. I think that the time was somewhere around 12:30 a.m. I remember it raining ever so slightly. We were all laughing and giggling about certain events that had happened at school that day, but I guess that isn't really relevant to the story. I told them that we should probably all go to sleep since it was extremely late and that I was really tired. Elle then replied, "Alright then, I guess it is a pretty shitty night after all." We had all started laughing at that response, and it eventually got to the point where we started talking less and less, and then eventually falling asleep from boredom. However, I didn't really fall asleep that night. I was rolling over in my bag and just trying to get into a comfortable position to sleep in, but had no luck falling asleep. I had my eyes wide open, staring at the blank ceiling. I looked at both X and L, who were both pretty wiped out into slumber. I got out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I possibly could, and then went into the kitchen to get a drink. But after I had my drink of water, I had heard some type of noise coming from a wall. I didn't really make it out at first, and I kinda had a difficult time trying to figure out what it was, and it was coming from the living room. I carefully went into the living room, and then tried my best not to step on L. I was standing in the middle of the room, trying my best to find out where the hell the sound was coming from. Okay, to give you a bit of context, if you enter the front door of the house, the living room is in the first room that you enter, and the left side of the living room where you enter is a giant window. Well, the tapping sound was coming from that window. My heart was starting to speed up now, but what was the only logical option, you may ask? To look through the window. I told myself to just go up to the window and see what it was, so I proceeded to do so. I stopped. There was something else. The windows were closed by blinds. I leaned my ear closer to the window. Now, along with the tapping, I could also hear breathing. I could barely just hear it over the rain. Very slow breathing. I couldn't say anything. I very slowly backed away from the window. I frantically woke up both X and L in a panic. They both said to me, "What? What is it?" in a grainy, tired voice. I told them to shush themselves and to listen. However, the tapping and breathing soon stopped. Elle then said, "Dude, I don't hear a thing." I told them what I heard, but they didn't believe me. I was getting mad. But then Elle suggested, "Why don't you just go outside and check?" I immediately said something along the lines of, "Fine, I'll go out there. In fact, why don't you both come out with me just to be sure?" I opened the door quietly and motioned my friends to come outside with me. We got to the window outside the house, and nothing. There was nothing there. X said to me, "I told you, I knew there wasn't going to be anything there." We both talked about it for a bit outside, and X said I was crazy, but the story doesn't end there. Out of the blue, Elle nervously said, "Wait, who's that guy over there?" We all looked, and there was a dark silhouette that was just standing still a few houses down the street. He was probably about 5'5", and he was wearing a raincoat from what I remember. My friends both looked at me, knowing that I wasn't crazy. The guy was just staring at us, not moving a muscle, but he then started laughing in a sort of sinister kind of way. Within that moment, I said softly, "Go for the backyard gate, right now, do it." The guy continued to stare at us while we both slid slowly to the gate, which was very close. Suddenly the guy just full-on sprinted right toward us without warning. My life was in slow motion. I dashed for the gate. All of us got in, and I was actually the last one to get in, and then I locked the gate. The guy ran into the gate with such force, but the gate didn't budge. The gate and fence were really high, and he couldn't possibly get over it. He then started banging and screaming at the gate, yelling things like,
"Come on out here and I'll kill you, you dumb teenagers."
And I'll honestly never forget that sentence. We made a run for it to the back door of the house and woke X's dad up. He bolted straight outside and said the guy made a run for it and was already halfway down the street. He chased after him, screaming for him to get back here. X's dad called the police straight away. They arrived a little while later with cops. 3 searched the area while 1 stopped to talk to me about it. The 3 cops found nothing except for a long and sharp kitchen knife that was dropped outside the front lawn. I shuddered. One of the policemen asked me if I knew what he looked like, but I couldn't make anything out other than he was somewhere around 5'5" and wearing a raincoat. He wasn't seen again after that, and he hasn't come back. But the police that day said they found dirty boot marks right outside the front door. But the really creepy part about the boot marks outside the door is that apparently that door had a peephole, and that peephole could make you see through both ways. Plus X's house is old, and that guy was possibly spying on us through it. Moral of the story is be very careful during the night, because anything can happen if you're not careful.
This story happened about 5 years ago. I was in high school at the time, probably a freshman or sophomore. One night in October, me and my friends all went to the high school football game. We'll call them Josh, Sam, and Jake for the story. I remember we all walked to the game together because we only lived a few miles from the school and we all lived in the same general neighborhood. After the game was over, we all started walking back home together. It was a kind of cold night and it was very dark outside. We left the high school campus and walked down the road that led to a quieter part of town. Then we walked past a popular local farm where they sold pumpkins every fall and also had a giant corn maze. Sam jokingly said we should do the corn maze now because it was dark and kind of creepy. I was willing to do it, but Josh and Jake didn't want to, so they stood by the end of the maze and me and Sam decided to race to see who could get through it first. This maze was no joke. It was a very popular attraction in our hometown, and each fall tons of people would come to it. We got to the beginning of the maze and both started going through it. We quickly went separate directions. There was a path going left and another one going right. Sam went left and I went right. The corn was very thick and stood about 10 feet tall. I walked through the maze and took a couple of turns. The farther I got in, things started to get quieter and quieter. My friends and I are very competitive, so I was determined to win, but I couldn't help but feel a little creeped out being in the middle of a corn maze late at night. I continued for about 5 more minutes in the maze. I had no idea where I was, if I was getting closer or farther from the finish. But then I started to hear footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was Sam, or else one of my other friends decided to enter the maze, so I sped up my walking to try to beat them. I continued to hear the steps, and eventually I just wanted to see who it was, so I turned around and looked behind me. When I did, I heard the corn rustle, but I didn't see anybody. I stood there for a few seconds waiting to hear or see them, but nobody appeared, and it remained silent. I even walked backwards in the maze a little bit, but still saw nothing. I shook my head and decided to continue. I started walking again, and once again started to hear footsteps. But this time it wasn't coming from behind me on the trail, it was coming from in the corn. I could kind of see some of the corn stalks moving around from somebody walking in them. It really didn't seem like something my friends would do, and it made me a little concerned. But who else would be in there at this time? I called out, "Sam?" But there was no response. Then I said, "You're not supposed to be in there, you have to stay on the path." And I chuckled a little, hoping to see one of my friends come out of the corn. But still nothing, and things got quiet once again. I was starting to get a bad feeling and was really creeped out. I decided the best thing to do was to just get out of the maze as quick as possible. I started walking sort of fast to try to find my way to the end. Not long after starting to walk, the noises in the corn started up again. I decided to just ignore them and keep walking. But then I started hearing the footsteps change from the corn to back on the path again. As soon as they did, I turned around and looked. But this time, I saw somebody slowly coming out from behind the corn and onto the path. It clearly was not one of my friends and looked like a grown man. It was dark out, and he was probably about 20 feet away. All I saw was his face, which was looking directly at me. As soon as I saw him, I took off running down the path as quick as I could. I wasn't stopping to think about which paths I would take, I just ran. I started yelling and calling out for my friends as I did. I started to barely hear their voices off in the distance. I knew I was getting closer to the end, and I kept running in that direction. When the path turned, I just ran into the corn and continued as fast as I could. Finally, I made it to the end and burst out. I saw my friends standing by the exit of the maze, which was about 20 feet to the left. Sam had already finished, and they all looked surprised to see me come out of the corn. I just ran to them and said that we had to go because there was a man in there that was following me. I started running all the way back home. My friends ran up to me and told me to relax and tell them what was going on, but I didn't feel comfortable doing so until we were far away from the maze. I finally told them the story, and they were pretty shocked. I'm not really sure who the man was or why he was in the maze, but I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he had caught up to me, and I'm always happy that I got out all right.
I'm a female, and at the time this story occurred, I was 15. My best friend Ellie would spend a lot of time in my house. I kind of just assumed that this was because she had 2 younger siblings that she didn't really get along with well, and the father wasn't in the picture and their mom was gone most of the time. Every weekend, Ellie would stay at my house. On this particular weekend, I'd asked Ellie if maybe we could stay at her house instead. I was just kind of wanting a break from my parents, and I had never stayed over at Ellie's house before. Her mother said that it would be fine and that she wasn't going to be home much anyway. We went to Ellie's house straight after school on a Friday. We sat down on the couch and we had watched some TV for a bit. After a while, we decided we wanted a snack and we went into the kitchen to see what we could find. They had a side door, and their kitchen was open with a screen on the outside. I was very startled when I saw a man standing in front of the screen door, looking inside. He looked to be in his late 30s, and he was really dirty and shaggy looking. I actually wondered if he was homeless. Once we made direct eye contact with him, he then said,
Well, hello there, young ladies.
"Dave," Ellie said. She told this guy Dave that her mom wasn't there. The man replied back,
Yeah, she never is. Who's your little friend here?
He asked as he creepily looked me up and down. She told him I was her friend and that we were just hanging out having a sleepover. Ellie seemed uncomfortable, and I was too. He stood there for a moment just smiling at us when he then said,
So are boys allowed? I'm sure a couple of cuties like you have boyfriends coming over.
We grew increasingly uncomfortable, and Ellie told him that she had to watch her brother and sister for the night, and that her mom would be home later. I knew that wasn't true, though. Her siblings were staying at her dad's that weekend, and her mom would be going out with her boyfriend, so most likely she wouldn't be coming home. The man was still standing at the door smiling at us. He then said,
Oh well, I guess. Tell your mom I stopped by. See you sexy ladies later.
When the man walked away, I asked Ellie what was that all about. She told me that Dave was her neighbor. Apparently her mom had gone on a date with him several years ago when they first moved in. Her mother wasn't impressed with Dave, and there was no second date. She said that he was cheap, had bad hygiene, not at all interesting, and was far too forward sexually. I guess this Dave character would stop by frequently trying to get the mom's attention and then flirt with her, much to everyone in the household's dismay. Ellie also said in the last couple of years, he seemed to start taking more interest in her, even making the horrific comment about how she's grown up enough to wear bras now. I was totally horrified. What a creep. We tried to relax some and forget about the creepy neighbor. We ate some junk food, watched some of our favorite shows, and also took some quizzes out of teen magazines. It was getting dark and we were starting to want dinner, so we ordered a large cheese pizza. Not even 10 minutes later, after the pizza had arrived, there was a knock at the front door. We were both really surprised as it was going on 9 p.m. at this point, and we weren't expecting anyone. Ellie got up and looked out the peephole. She looked right back at me wide-eyed. She put her finger up to her mouth and told me to be quiet. There was another knock at the door, then a voice. It was Dave.
"Girls, I know you're home,"
he said. We were both frozen in fear. Then Dave the creep said something along the lines of that he knew we were alone and saw that we were hungry for a pizza, and so he thought he'd bring us a large sausage. Yeah, I know. Cringe. After a few minutes of not responding, Dave said something about us being stuck-up little girls and then left. We went around the house closing all the blinds and making sure all the doors were locked. We were so scared that we barely had the volume of the TV up and kept the room lit with one tiny dim lamp out of fear of Dave seeing or hearing us. Once it got to be around 10:30, we were really fed up with having to sit still in the dark. Ellie got up and peeked out the window at Dave's house. She said that all of his lights were off, so he probably went out or went to bed. We felt comfortable enough to turn on some lights and relax a bit, so we put on some music and chatted some. We were sitting on the piano bench in front of the dining room windows when all of a sudden we then heard a tapping outside the window. I guess we had only closed the shades halfway, because when we looked over, you guessed it, there was Dave peeking in. He held up a 6-pack of beer saying that he knew Ellie's mom wasn't home, and that we should let him in so we can all party together. I guess Ellie had enough at this point, because she stood up and yelled at him, "No," and that he needed to leave. Dave had a completely blank look on his face, and then he said,
"You know I can just come in, right?"
Ellie then yelled at him that she had spoken with her mom and she was calling the police. Well, at that point, Creeper Dave started to back away, saying he was just kidding and that we needed to calm down. Ellie stood her ground until she knew Dave was in his house, then proceeded to call her mom's boyfriend's house. She told her mom all the creepy things Dave had been doing, but her mom didn't believe us and she thought we were making things up. She said we should just go to bed and everything would be fine. Ellie was so upset. We ended up locking ourselves upstairs in her mother's bedroom. We didn't have any more problems with Dave that night, and we finally got some sleep. After that night, as you can imagine, we decided to just go back to sleepovers at my house, and I think that's for the best.
I think all kids think their parents are strict. It's all a matter of perspective, isn't it? Like, I used to think my parents were strict because I had to set bedtime and curfews on weekends, but then I stayed over to a friend's house for the first time when I was 13, and it changed my entire view of my parents. Because his mom was an actual tyrant. Like, it was scary to watch. We live in a rural area, my friend even more so. Like, again, I thought I lived out in the sticks, but he lived miles from even the smallest towns, like right on the outskirts of Galloway Forest Park. It was a nice wee gaff, but it was old school, proper old school. Like, all of the locks were latches instead of key locks, which meant all of the doors were accessible from the inside and outside, including bedrooms and bathrooms. On the evening in question, we had a nice enough time, watching James Bond movies in between rounds of deathmatch on N64's GoldenEye. Admittedly, I was a proper little mummy's boy at the time, and I was pretty uncomfortable at sleeping over at a friend's place, more so because of the distance from home. But like I said, the evening was good up until a point. We were both immersed into the whole Bond lore, stuffing ourselves with pizza and arguing over Brosnan versus Connery. Then, as we're talking, my friend's mum comes into the lounge, calmly walked up to him, then gives him the biggest, loudest, hardest slap in the face I'd ever seen. Like it was almost more like an open palm smack than anything else. I'd never seen anything like that. I mean, not a parent hitting a child anyway. So, in the seconds that followed, I was literally just like, what just happened? My mate burst into tears, crying, gets up and runs upstairs with his mum in hot pursuit, and the whole time she's screaming stuff like disgusting at him. I was just dumbstruck. There I was, chilling with my mate when his mum just comes up and annihilates his face for apparently no bloody reason whatsoever. Anyway, they both disappear upstairs and I'm left on my own to wonder what's going on. I just stay there, not knowing what else to do, waiting for them to reappear. When they do, My mate just plonks himself on the sofa, red in the face, eyes all puffy from crying. Then, when his mom is out of earshot, I asked what happened. Turns out that she smacked him square in the face because he was eating with his mouth open. Yep, eating with his mouth open. That's all he did to deserve that open palm punch to the face. After that, I was petrified of this guy's mom. I mean, we didn't have very many sleepovers at his place, and I have a few more stories involving the absence of any privacy because of those old locks situation. Don't get me wrong, I know there's way more harrowing things out there as an adult, but the way she treated him was the most abusive parenting I'd ever seen. This guy's parents were some of the scariest people I'd encountered in my life, let alone my childhood. If he was punished that bad for just eating with his mouth open, what else did the poor kid suffer through for other seemingly minor infractions? It made me feel very, very lucky to have the parents I did. Let me just put it that way. I had a guy come into the 7-Eleven I was working at, and when I was ringing up the items he wanted, he started getting all fresh with me, saying stuff like, "You're real pretty," and "What time do you finish work?" I lied to him and told him I was on till 11 even though I was finishing at 6, which was only like an hour away. He'd said he'd come back then, and we could go out for a beer or something, but I advised him not to since my boyfriend would be coming to pick me up around then, and he really wouldn't like the idea of some random guy hitting on me. That didn't seem to bother the guy too much though, and he made some dumb comment about how he'd make my boyfriend see things his way or something. I just nodded like, "Yep, I'm sure you will," and I could see him getting kind of angry before he walked out of the store. It didn't bother me too much, as he was only going to come back to the store later on to find out I wasn't there, and by that time, I'd be safe at home and away from any pervy creepers. But then at 6, when my shift finished, I walked outside with my purse only to see a car door open about 20 or 30 feet away. I swear I just about felt my stomach tie into a knot when I saw the creeper step out. I did a straight-up 180-degree turn on my heel and started walking back into the store, then just went right behind the counter and into the manager's office after telling my coworker, "Just say I'm on break." He seemed real confused for a second, but as I shut the door and listened right at the edge of it, it was maybe only 30 seconds at the most before I heard him say, "Oh, her? She's just on break. I'm sure she'll be out in a minute." Normally, I'd take the bus back home, but that night, I knew I'd have to get an Uber if I wanted to make it home without being seriously harassed. So I called the Uber, waited for it to arrive, then tried to just walk out as fast as I could. I didn't see the guy in the store, and I asked my coworker real quick, "Are they waiting for me?" And the guy shook his head, still confused, but kind of getting the gist of what was actually happening. They asked if I wanted them to call the cops, and I shook my head, just gunning for my Uber as I pushed open the glass door. I didn't see the guy anywhere, and I was so set on getting into the Uber that I didn't look left or right as I walked out of the 7-Eleven, so I had basically no warning that the guy was about to grab my arm and jerk me back. He looked really, really angry as he growled, "You lied to me," and called me a bunch of names as I tried pulling away from him. Luckily, my Uber driver saw absolutely everything, and he stepped out of the driver's seat to be all like, "Hey, let her go or I'll call the cops." He did let me go, and just smiled at the Uber driver as he told me, "This isn't over. I don't like being lied to." I wish that was all bluster too, like he was trying to act hard just to save a little face, but he wasn't, and for the next 3 months, he made my life a living hell. He kept showing up outside of the 7-Eleven, to the point where I had to blow a ton of my wages on Ubers to and from work. Then there was the time he actually tried to follow me home, and I had to actually tell the Uber driver what was happening so he could drive into the city just to shake the guy's tail. I tipped that guy massively. Even though he initially refused to accept the payment for the ride, he insisted on canceling until I burst into tears and begged him to take the money and my tip. I couldn't make it someone else's problem. I couldn't have that on my mind as well as all the other stuff. I developed something of a relationship with that one specific Uber driver, and he became kind of a father figure who always accepted my ride requests whenever he was working and made sure that no one followed me home. He was also the guy that told me that I needed to get the cops involved, and I thought that this guy was going to hurt me, that he knew people with the same mentality and that they only ever actually gave up when the law got involved. I didn't even know why I was surprised when I found out that the guy had a previous conviction for stalking, and he seemed to know the legal process like the back of his hand. He knew the process of getting the restraining order through the courts would take weeks at a minimum, and he'd come visit me in the 7-Eleven just to taunt me sometimes, and he'd only leave once I threatened to call the cops on him. That was just about the only thing that seemed to really get to him too, the fact that he'd been arrested and convicted over something like that before. I wanted to tell him that he was pathetic, that he'd never ever have a good normal woman all to himself, that he'd always be some deranged psycho who got off on terrorizing those who couldn't defend themselves. But I didn't. In fact, I was told by one of the cops I spoke to, do not antagonize this man under any circumstances. We don't know how far he'll push this if you make him angry. If it's possible, do not engage him whatsoever. So like I said, that was my life for like a whole 3 months, until the day finally came when my mom got the call from our family's attorney saying a judge had finally approved the restraining order. For those wondering, it took so long because this guy had no history of actual violence, and the whole arm-grabbing incident wasn't actually classed as an assault for whatever reason. The day it finally came through, though, he must have gotten some kind of notification of it because he just stopped showing up at the 7-Eleven. Seeing him waiting for me outside whenever I finished was such a regular occurrence that when he finally didn't show up, I actually cried with relief. I told Carl, the Uber driver, that I thought I was finally free, and we had a miniature kind of celebration on that final drive back to my house. He still picks me up from time to time, too, sometimes when I've been out drinking with my friends, and it's awesome to be reunited with him after such a sickening ordeal. I suppose half the reason I'm sharing this is to help other girls avoid going through the same thing I did. Don't hesitate to get the cops involved with something like a stalking issue. There are literally laws in place to help deal with things like that. But the big thing, don't ever show a soft side or seem like you're playing hard to get. If a guy shows you any unwanted attention, either completely ignore him or make it clear that you'll just call the cops. Heck, carry a stun gun or pepper spray if you're legally able to in your state, and just show that SOB that you're carrying so they leave you alone. I just don't want any other girl to go through what I went through because I honestly lost almost 4 months of my life to this guy's mental abuse.
I live nearby a rather large city, and for my job, I often walk to work. It takes me about 20 to 30 minutes. There is a park with the woods that I often walk through because it's on the way and it's much more scenic. One day last fall, probably late October or early November, I was on my way to work at about 7 a.m. It was still pretty dark out at this time, but the sun was beginning to come up. I got onto the path in the woods and walked for about 5 minutes on it, but then I started to hear footsteps coming from directly behind me. Typically, I would never see anybody in the woods, and not until I got closer to work. Still, it wasn't a big deal to see somebody, but being a woman alone in a large city in the middle of a woods, you always have to be alert. I glanced over my shoulder to see who it was, but I saw no one. It was really strange because I was sure I had just heard footsteps. It made me a little more concerned, thinking that somebody was possibly hiding from me now. I just kept walking though because I knew I would be out of the woods within 10 minutes. A short time later, I heard the footsteps again. I ignored them and kept walking. However, they seemed to be getting closer, so once again I looked, but I saw nothing. I knew now that something was definitely up. I reached into my purse and felt around until I found my pepper spray. Then I kept walking. The footsteps started up for a third time and got closer and closer to me. Finally, I felt somebody grab my shoulder. I turned around quickly, ready to spray, but again nobody was there. It was the strangest thing ever. I stood there looking around in disbelief for a good 30 seconds. I knew what I felt, and I knew what I heard. I didn't know what to do, so I just went on with my business and didn't hear the footsteps again. Needless to say, I don't walk in those woods anymore.
More than a decade ago, on one of the hottest days of the year, I was taking my kids down to the 7-Eleven near our apartment block to get some big gulps. Just as we were walking past a public park, right near a tree line, this completely normal, well-dressed looking couple came out of the trees and starts walking right towards us. I actually couldn't believe it when the guy suddenly told me to give him my wallet and anything else in my pockets. I mean, I thought it was a dumb joke of some kind. They looked so well-dressed that they could have been office workers or something. I actually let out this nervous laughter, then asked if they were serious, and the guy answered my question by pulling out what looked like a fishing knife from his jacket pocket. When he opened it and pointed it at me, I shoved my daughter behind me to protect her as best I could. But then, just as I was going to do the same for my son, the woman grabbed his other arm and began pulling him towards her. I honestly felt like my heart was about to explode with fear. There's no other way of describing it. And I suddenly just lost all sense of self-preservation as I leapt forward to attack this well-to-do looking woman who just grabbed my boy. The next thing I know, I felt what I can only describe as a cold punch under the ribs of my left side, and I looked down to see that the guy had buried his fishing knife in my stomach. What came next feels a little bit like divine intervention, as two joggers had spotted what was going on and came over to intervene. This scared off at least one of the unassuming muggers, but as I turned to check on my kids, I just sort of felt like my legs fall out from underneath me, and I hit the ground hard. I remember hearing someone screaming and thinking it was my daughter, but when I looked, the woman who grabbed my son was on the ground crying and wailing with blood pouring out of her mouth. I honestly don't remember hitting her, but she seemed pretty adamant that I did, and she was actually trying to make out like she was the victim of the whole situation, maybe to avoid getting arrested when the cops showed up. The police that patrolled the park showed up not long after that, and the cops actually started asking the woman what happened, like we were a couple or something. My kids had to tell them that she was the partner of the guy that stabbed me, and this definitely threw the joggers off too, because they had definitely assumed that that was the case too. The whole time I just kept begging someone to call an ambulance because I was pretty sure that I was bleeding to death. I got taken to the hospital and, to my complete disbelief, I was questioned about the incident as if though I was a suspect. I had no idea what this was about until a while after, when it looked more and more likely that I was going to be charged with battery for the woman, since it turns out she actually had a decently well-off family and had gotten into some vicious cycle of addiction with some trust fund junkies she met in the city. Her family actually tried to sue me when the charges didn't stick, but it was thrown out and she was sentenced for attempted kidnapping not long after. As for me, I had a tube in my chest for 2 weeks after my surgery to remove the knife, but I thankfully made a full recovery. Honestly, when I look back at it, I'm just glad my kids didn't get hurt in any way, and I still run through all the horrific scenarios in my head where they didn't walk away from that situation unscathed.
The first and only time I ever went to Chuck E. Cheese was back in the year 2005. I was a little kid at the time, and I remember that my older brother got invited to one of his friends' birthday parties, which was going to be at the Chuck E. Cheese. My parents were invited as well, so they said that I could come with. I was excited to go there because I had always wanted to. It seemed like so much fun with the arcade games, the pizza, and everything. I remember that the party was on a Sunday, I think, and when we got there, my parents got a pizza, and my brother went to hang out with his friends. I knew some of the kids that were there, but they were mostly my brother's friends, so I could kind of do my own thing. My brother's friend who the party was for was named Tyler, and his parents got a bunch of tokens for everyone. They gave me a little paper cup with a bunch of tokens in it, and I began going around playing some of the machines. I was trying to find the best machines that would have the best payout of tickets. I saw that the Chuck E. Cheese had some pretty cool prizes you could win with the tickets. After playing maybe half the arcade games they had in there, I found this one in the corner that I really liked a lot. I was getting on a winning streak, and after the second time playing it, I had quite a few tickets and played it for a third time. I was right in the middle of the game when all of a sudden, the whole thing suddenly went black and froze. It was really strange. I pushed some of the buttons and messed around with it a little bit, but nothing worked. The screen was completely black, and nothing I did seemed to affect it. I was a little kid, so I didn't really know how the machines worked, but I just figured it was broken. Then, I saw a man appear next to the machine. He was wearing a shirt with a Chuck E. Cheese logo and asked me what had happened. I told him the machine was broken, and he took a look at it and saw how it wasn't working. He pushed a few of the buttons and then went around to the back of the machine. It seemed like he was working on it, and a short time later, he returned and said that it appeared as though the machine was broken and it would be out of order for a while. Then he apologized to me and told me he could get me the tickets that I would have won and some extra tokens for the trouble. I was glad to hear this because I would have already won a good amount of tickets from the game before it broke. The guy started to walk away and told me to follow him. We went off to the side of the room and then into a hallway which led to the back. I stopped at the entrance of the hallway that said employees only, but then I was told to keep going. I followed the guy down the hall and then we reached a side door. The guy then backed up and grabbed my arm tightly. He opened the door, which turned out to be an exit of the building. I could see outside, and he pulled my arm and forced me to follow him. I asked the man what was going on, but he didn't answer me. I was starting to panic. The guy had a strong grip on my arm, and it looked like we were going out to his car. I really didn't want to go any further, and I was desperate. As we got closer, I suddenly took my leg and kicked the man right in the groin area. It really took him by surprise, and he dropped to his knees for a second, and his grip became much looser. I pulled away from the man and started running back, but I decided to go around to the front of the Chuck E. Cheese. Once I had made it around to the front, I went in the entrance doors and ran back inside to my parents. When I got there, they saw me and asked me what was wrong. After I told them what had happened, they decided to call the police and talk with the managers as well. I remember I had to talk with the police for a while. Looking back at that day, I realized that the man didn't work at Chuck E. Cheese at all, and he most likely just unplugged the game I was playing himself. When I was a child, I remember I always got excited when the fall came, because Halloween was one of my favorite holidays. Usually, a couple of weeks before, my little sister and I would carve pumpkins and then put them out on the front step. We would always try to carve cool faces or designs into the pumpkins. One year when I was probably 8 or 9 years old, my mother went to the store and got some really nice big pumpkins. When she got back from the store at night, we decided to carve them. I made a creepy looking pumpkin face on mine, and my sister did one smiling. When we were done carving them, my sister and I went outside to put them on the front step. As soon as we stepped out the front door, though, we saw a man in our driveway. It was really dark outside, but we could both clearly see him. I couldn't make out much details about him, but I just remember that he looked kind of short and about middle-aged. As soon as he saw us, he ran away. But he didn't run back down the driveway to the street. Instead, he ran to the side of our house near our garage. My sister and I both ran back inside to our mother and told her what we had seen. She called my dad into the room, and he went outside to investigate. When he came back inside about 10 minutes later, he said that he didn't see or hear anybody out there. So after that, our parents both went inside with us, and we put our pumpkins on the front step. Then we went back inside once again. The next morning when I woke up, I went downstairs and saw that my mom was on the phone with the police. I asked what had happened, and my dad showed me that the back door to the house had been damaged and the window was smashed. Our pumpkins on the front step were also smashed. However, nothing was missing inside the house or damaged. The police came, and I ended up having to talk to them and tell them what I had saw. The man was never caught, and I don't know who he was.
Before I start this, I just want to say that I in no way blame this on my friend or her mother at all. The story takes place around 2 years ago, during the summer of 2019. I was 14 years old at the time, and I had a really big group of friends that I would go to the pool with like almost every day. We all lived only a few houses away from each other, except for about 3 of the girls. There were 8 of us. The day was like every other day. We woke up, put on our bathing suits, and we had our friend Ryan's mom take us to the pool. She happened to have a minivan that could fit us all. We got to the pool around 11 a.m. and swam until about 9 p.m. when the pool closed. Since all of our parents were super close and we still wanted to keep the fun going, we decided to crash at our friend Ava's house. She had a huge downstairs basement that was soundproof because her dad used to teach guitar and drum lessons to people all the time down there. Two of our friends, Carly and Aaron, didn't really want to go because they felt really tired and dizzy for being out all day and night. So we said our goodbyes to the two of them as their parents came and picked them up. And it only took about 4 minutes for Ava's mom to come get us. She had a smaller car, so we had to squeeze in a little more. When we got to Ava's house, we came inside and thanked her mom for driving us before going to get some snacks from the kitchen. As we walked into the kitchen, we could see Ava's stepdad, David. None of us really liked David since he kind of had a reputation of being really creepy towards us and making rude comments to us whenever our parents came to pick us up. We walked to the cabinets and grabbed all we needed and proceeded to pile down the stairs to the basement. Let me give you a quick layout of the basement. As soon as you walk down the stairs, to your right is sort of a kitchen and workroom, and then to your left is a basement living room. And then once you walk past the sofas, there's a pool table. On the left of the pool table, there's a hallway where on the left is a bathroom and storage room, and then to your right is a bedroom. All of us really smelled of sunscreen and chlorine, so we split into groups of 2 and went to each different room to change out of the bathing suits and into clothes. The basement was kinda creepy, and none of us wanted to be alone in any of the rooms due to the previous paranormal experiences we've had there. Ava always had spare shirts that she'd let us wear that used to be her dad's, and since most of us were 5'2" and shorter, the shirts covered us enough that we didn't need to wear shorts. And if you're wondering, yes, we washed our hair. We would usually take turns taking a shower, but we were so tired that we just tilted our heads back over the tub and then took turns washing each other's hair. Once we finished with that, we walked to the basement bedroom and got comfortable. We made bracelets, talked about drama and the new school year coming up, eat junk food, drink Pepsi, and then watched the new season of Stranger Things. After around 3 hours of this, our friend Ryder was asleep on the bed while the rest of us sat on the floor talking. While Ava was halfway through her sentence, we heard the stairs of the basement then creaking. All of us were silent. Ava said it could just be one of her cats or something, but before she could even finish, we then heard around 6 more steps from the basement stairs area. Ryan, the oldest of us, seemingly the most freaked out, quietly walked to the door and locked it while me and my friend Molly went to turn off the lights. We waited around 5 minutes, the only light coming from the computer screen that we'd been watching Netflix on. We quietly whispered about what the noise could be until we heard sliding footsteps coming into the hallway of the basement. Me and Ava grabbed onto each other as everyone else fell silent. After about 2 minutes of hearing nothing, we all then moved to the bed. While doing this, we managed to wake up Ryder, who then loudly asked, "What the hell are y'all doing?" Ryan covered his mouth with his hands while telling him what was going on. Ryder, who hates when people wake him up, sat up and told us to calm down as he walked to the basement bedroom door and unlocked it. He swung the door open, and what we saw made us all stiff as a board with fear. There in the doorway was Ava's stepdad. Her stepdad was terrifying. He was 6'4", short brownish hair, heavyset, and he had these square glasses that could reflect about anything. Me and everybody else in the room screamed at the top of our lungs as Ryder slammed the door in his face, locked it, and ran into the bed into me and Ryan's arms. We all stayed as silent as possible as we waited for what felt like hours, as we heard Ava's stepdad groaning and asking if he could join us. Our friend Izzy and I began to cry while Ava called her mom to come down and get him. After I'd say about 45 minutes, all was silent and we ended up falling asleep piled up on top one another. We woke to the sound of Ava's mom knocking on the door. We then unlocked it and let her in. She then explained to us how after she brought David back up, he then told her,
"That many young girls down in the dark basement all by themselves is really dangerous. Anything could happen and no one would hear anything. Thank goodness those 2 boys were in there and were smart enough to lock the door in case anyone tried to do anything."
When her mom told us this, I felt sick to my stomach. When I looked over, I saw the look of pure horror and disbelief on everyone's faces. After that, we all decided to go home. I'm 16 years old now, and Ava's stepdad passed away due to the coronavirus. Me and those girls aren't as close anymore,
But that night and all the other experiences we've had since then have stayed between us, and they probably always will.
Last fall, my girlfriend and I went to a pumpkin patch. It was a yearly tradition for us to carve pumpkins, so we were going to get the best ones that we could find. This pumpkin patch that we went to was owned by a nice old couple that ran it every single year. We had gone the previous year, so we came back again for a second time. We went on a Thursday evening, and it was later in the day when we arrived, which was nice because there weren't a lot of other people there. There were lots of pumpkins in a field that was right next to a large woods. The older couple that owned the place greeted us as we entered, and then we started looking for a good pumpkin. Of course, towards the front, there were not a lot of good pumpkins. Most had been picked over, but the farther you got into the field, you could see some really nice ones. I'm not all that picky about which pumpkin to get, but my girlfriend always has to have the perfect ones. So we wandered farther and farther out until we were around the corner of the field, almost in the woods, to a more secluded area. It was sort of hidden, but when we got there, we saw there were lots of nice pumpkins, and we started looking through them all. I would say we were there for about 10 minutes until it started to get really dark out, so we decided to wrap things up and get our pumpkins. But just as we were deciding on the last one we would get, we heard something coming from just inside the woods. We both looked over to see what was there. We saw what appeared to be the old couple standing halfway behind a tree, looking at us. But they both had really creepy smiles on their faces, and their eyes were open super wide. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing for a few seconds. I had no idea what they were doing. They just stood there staring. Finally, I said hello to them, but they didn't answer. They just slowly disappeared behind the tree and then walked deeper into the woods. My girlfriend was just as confused as me and really creeped out. We had no interest to go into the woods and see where they went. Instead, we walked back to the front of the field to the entrance. The couple was gone now, and we were the only people there. We decided to leave the pumpkins and just get out of there. We went elsewhere to get our pumpkins that year, and haven't returned there since.
I had a sleepover when I was about 8 or 9. Me and my best friend were watching the Scooby-Doo episode with the creepy voodoo dolls. We're having a whale of a time, enjoying all the wholesome spooks, but when she sees the voodoo dolls, I can see my friend getting visibly nervous. I knew her mom was hardcore Christian and looked down on all that kinds of magical or satanic stuff, but I had no idea just how bad she'd fly off the handle when she caught us watching freaking Scooby-Doo, of all things. Bearing in mind it was my friend who put the show on in the first place, but when my friend's mom wanders in to see what we're watching, she just assumes it was me that put it on. She yanks me up from sitting, then proceeds to scream in my face that I was disgusting and that I was going to hell for making her daughter watch that kind of filth. And right as I'm about to burst into tears, she slaps me so hard across the side of the head. I just lost it, bolted up to her bedroom, locked myself inside, and called my dad. She's banging on the door telling me she's gonna beat me for being a sinner. My dad can hear this and just yells, "I'm on my way," into the phone before passing it to my mom. I was so scared, more scared than I think I ever was during my entire childhood, and the minutes of waiting in that locked bedroom for my dad to show up were some of the longest of my whole life. When he showed up, I was in the back bedroom, so the only way I knew he was there was when my friend's mom answered a banging at the door and started screaming at someone. I ran down the stairs, and as soon as he saw me, my dad basically pushed the woman on her butt, grabbed me, and then we got out of there. It was a whole drama after that. The police were involved. Charges were filed, but the worst part, it totally soured my friendship with the girl who I was having the sleepover with. I wasn't ever allowed to visit her house, and her mom pretty much ordered her not to hang out with me anymore. It was sad, really sad, but I guess that's just how life is, sometimes. Please don't think I'm trying to throw myself a pity party here, because I'm doing much better in my adult life. But back when I was a kid, I had an incredibly toxic home life, and as a result, I went to school basically with little to no social skills. I made just one friend, and even then it was only on accident because she was being nice to me after I tripped and broke my toy on the bus. Her name was Rachel. Rachel's BFF was named Emily, and Emily was the prettiest, coolest girl in class. So imagine my delight when one day I find myself getting an invite to Emily's birthday sleepover. To this day I can remember how excited I was. My first sleepover. It was indescribably validating. I beamed at that invitation over and over again like it was a trophy or something, and begged my mom to give me a ride to the sleepover early. I didn't want to miss a single minute of it. Then, on the night of the sleepover, I found it wasn't quite as enjoyable as I thought it would be. It was a real fun atmosphere and all, but Emily and Rachel weren't exactly being very warm with me, and I could really obviously detect it. Then, right as I'm lying on my back with a pillow under my head, just relaxing, I feel Emily straddle my stomach while Rachel seems to hold my legs down. Emily then grabs the pillow out from under my head, shoves it over my face, then proceeds to tell me how ugly I am and how she never wanted to invite me. It hurt. Emotionally, I mean. It cut really, really deep. But that feeling was nothing to the one I felt when I realized I couldn't breathe. I struggled and struggled, but still that horrid little girl kept that pillow over my face until I felt myself passing out. It was only when her mom walked in to see what all the fuss was about that she took it away from my face. I still can't see their names without remembering how awful that memory is to me, but I'm glad to say that there were definitely repercussions. Rachel was grounded for a long time for letting it happen. I know that, but Emily ended up getting like a psychological evaluation or whatever, which revealed that she had some serious personality disorders. This was all part of her being arrested as a juvenile, and she only narrowly avoided attempted murder charges. It caused a huge thing in our community, and it was so bad that, in the end, Emily's parents had to just pack up their family and leave town. But before I end this, let me say it again. I'm not looking for sympathy here. All that stuff is long in the past. Childhood was not kind to me, but I promise you, these days I'm in a much better place and surrounded by all the friends a girl could possibly wish for. And only 2 of them are cats. We're going back many, many years for this, but I grew up in Northern California in quite a poor rural area. Some of my best friends from elementary and middle school lived like 10 to 15 miles away, so on weekends, instead of just going over to visit for the day, we'd have sleepovers to save our parents driving these crazy round trips. So I had this one friend called Star, whose parents were like old school hippies. Their house always smelled of patchouli. They were vegan before vegan was even really a thing, and aside from a few unusual recreational activities, they were basically just as good as being parents as any other couple. They were sweet, loving, and attentive, and I always had a ball whenever I went to sleepovers at their place, mainly because they'd let us stay outdoors in a tent at night, which was just such a huge adventure for a little group of preteen tomboys. Anyways, this one night we're staying in a tent in the backyard, but it was a backyard that extended to one side of the house. Where we're camped is in the view of the TV room window, so Star's mom and dad could keep an eye on us, but it also meant we could see the driveway from the flap of our tent. It was summertime, so it was still incredibly warm at night, so we ended up leaving the tent flat unzipped to let some cool air in. It obviously wasn't open all the way because bugs, but we can still see outside the tent. Then, in the middle of the night, Star shakes me awake and whispers, "There's someone in the driveway." I'm thinking it might have been her big brother, who was a few years older than us and was attending college. But when I suggested that, she said, "No, there's a bunch of people, look." I start getting real anxious hearing that, so I quietly creep up to the tent flap to peek out, and that's when I saw that Star was exactly right. In the little bit of moonlight that we had, I literally lost count of the number of people I saw creeping up her driveway. It was seriously one of the scariest moments of my life, mainly because there was absolutely nothing to do but keep as quiet as possible. We couldn't call the cops. This was way before cell phones. We couldn't warn Star's parents without revealing our presence. We were just powerless, forced to watch people who obviously didn't have good intentions slowly approaching Star's house. I think in the end, Star just broke, and in a move you could either call real brave or real stupid, she just ran out of the tent shouting, "Get away from my house," and then, "Mom, Dad, call the cops." As soon as she starts screaming, a bunch of flashlights burst into life, obviously held by the guy sneaking up the driveway. And oh my God, there were so many of them. At first glance in the darkness, it looked no more than about 5 or 6 people, but when they all turned their flashlights on, it was clear the number was more like 15 or 20. I just hear, "Sheriff's Department, show me your hands." And that was incredibly confusing because we were all about calling the cops to get help, but the cops were already here? Anyway, Star does as she's told, while me and our friends start climbing out of the tent with our hands in the air. That's when the person approaching us started saying, "Jesus, they're just kids, man." And with them being closer, I could see that they really were cops, with caps and badges and all patches on their arms, all that stuff. Then I hear, "Go, go, go, get in there." And the cops start bashing the front door to the house in while other cops fanned around the backyard and headed towards one of the barns. We were scared, obviously, but we're so focused on just staying down and watching that we're not really freaking out too bad. But when the cops start dragging Star's mom and dad out of the house and arresting them, she had to be restrained by the cop that was guarding us. After that, the cops drove me and our friend back to our respective homes. Then, I don't know what they did with Star. I think they took her to her grandma's or her aunt's or whatever. Then a few days later, we find out that Star's mom and dad had been growing something they shouldn't have in one of their barns. I get that it was illegal and stuff, but the aftermath was just so sad. Star had to go live with her relatives because her parents were sent off to prison for a few years. It was messed up. And I get that the cops were just doing their job and stuff, but it was definitely one of the scariest times of my life, seeing all those figures in black, just creeping towards my friend's house. One of the most chilling moments of my whole life was while working at 7-Eleven. Some guy walks in wearing a suit, staggers over to one of the fridges and grabs a ton of those Starbucks cold brews out of one of them before dumping them all on the counter in front of me. The stink of booze off of him was just wild, and as I'm ringing him up, I asked if he'd either had a really good day or a really bad one. He's let out this really hearty laugh and then tells me, "A little of both." He then goes on to explain that he'd just gotten out of court, and that he's been acquitted of accidentally shooting one of his hunting buddies on a trip that happened a few years ago. I was so stunned that I didn't really know what to say. I just went with the first thing that came to mind, which was, "I'm sorry." He laughs again, shakes his head, and then asks me, "You know what the funniest thing is, though?" I shake my head, taking the 10 he gave me before grabbing his change from the register, and when he tells me, I swear I almost dropped his money all over the floor when he spoke. He tells me, "It was no accident." Then just starts laughing to himself while he pockets the change and scoops up all the cold brews from the counter. I was so taken aback that all I could do was just stand there, watching the guy as he walked out of the store and towards his parked car. Then my mind switches to thinking, please get into the passenger seat, please get into the passenger seat. But nope. He climbs right into the driver's side, starts the engine, then drives off. I'm not saying I have a photographic memory or anything, more like I was repeating his license plate number back to myself as I grabbed my phone and plugged it into the Notepad app. Then I called the cops, told them they had a drunk driver on their hands, then just let karma do its thing. There was nothing I could do about him taking one person's life and getting away with it. But I sure wasn't about to stand by and let him kill someone else as the result of being a reckless idiot.
If you went to school any time from the 90s onwards, the chances are that you've at least experienced a lockdown drill, maybe even an actual lockdown. Obviously, not all of them end in tragedy. Some schools go into lockdown because of a crime committed nearby, or because some parent forgot to wear their visitor's badge. There's lots of different reasons. Most of them have nothing to do with an actual legitimate threat to students. But better safe than sorry, right? I went to school in a post-Columbine world. Lockdowns were always taken very seriously, despite the fact that we lived in a fairly isolated area where most people knew each other. There were regular petitions to allow teachers to carry guns in school. Who knew how long it might take the police to arrive if something were to ever happen? But obviously, I'm not here to debate gun control, so I'll get to the point. Most lockdowns are drills, but I'm going to tell you about one that wasn't. I've always been a pretty nervous and paranoid person. For example, throughout middle and high school, I despised being in the cafeteria because I always seemed to get stuck sitting in some corner nowhere near an exit. It made me anxious, realizing just how much distance I would have to cross just to get out, even if something as innocent as a food fight were to occur. In upstairs classrooms, I would occasionally glance out the windows and ponder where or not the drop might kill me, or if I can make it out with just a broken arm or leg. In downstairs rooms, I would tend to sit near the windows unless I was forced to sit somewhere else. Admittedly, this was also because I just like to look outside and daydream. But like most routines, after enough repetition, you get used to almost anything. If you work in a school, you probably know this like the back of your hand. In the event of a lockdown, teachers are supposed to lock the doors, turn out the lights, and herd students into a part of the room that can't be seen from the window panel on the door. This always seemed a bit ridiculous to me. I once had an English class in a room where the only spot that you couldn't see people from the door was, ironically, right next to the door. The idea of us just lining up there while someone jiggled the knob outside sounded horrifying. However, I did have one major concern. What would happen if I were caught in one of these drills outside the classroom? Was I supposed to run and bang on the nearest door, hide in a closet, run outside? I always figured if it came down to it, if I was near an exit and it seemed like the real deal, I would take my chances running outside. Teachers never really told us during drills whether or not they were real, but someone always knew. There was always that one kid whose mom worked at the school and would tell everyone else that they weren't real and that there would be a fire drill the next day or something. They have a special code for when it's real. A girl named Kelly once informed our entire algebra class, if they say lockdown 3 times, it's only a drill. 4 times, it's for real. We all snickered, but what she said lingered in the back of my mind every time the principal went on the loudspeaker, voice crackling throughout the building, and I always counted, awaiting for that 4th time. 11th grade swung around. Now officially an upperclassman, I let a certain confidence seep into my step. I was 16. Next year I would graduate and would be going to college. I practically owned this dump. I would see everyone that I hated working at McDonald's. You know, the usual 16-year-old spiel. I no longer felt the need to rush into first period. Instead, I lingered in the hallway with other relaxed juniors and seniors and made fun of confused freshmen, and actually made eye contact with my teachers. This newfound skip in my step was what led me to cutting the first period bell very close, as I wiped out my shirt with a wet paper towel in the bathroom. Someone had tripped on the bus, and had gotten what I prayed was iced coffee on me. The stain did not look like it was coming out, and I hadn't brought a jacket that day. I groaned, balled up the paper towel, and chucked it at the garbage. I missed. Through the thick bathroom walls, I heard the distant crackle of the loudspeaker. Were they starting the morning announcements earlier this year? Maybe someone had parked in a teacher spot, again. Lockdown, 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 lockdown. I was more caught off guard by the fact that it sounded like the secretary was making the announcement than anything else. Only after a moment or two did it sink in. This wasn't a drill. I stood there, completely motionless, wondering what the hell I was supposed to do. Finally, I lunged towards the door and yanked it open, peering out into the hall. Every door was shut. I was on the 2nd floor. I thought I heard distant yelling from below. My panic then settled into a cold fear that pulled in the pit of my stomach. I darted back into the bathroom, trying to rationalize things. Maybe I had misheard it and it was just a drill. I tried to remember how the person on the loudspeaker had sounded. Were they frightened? Forced calm? I don't know, and not knowing was the worst part. The police had to be on their way if this was real, I assured myself. So as long as I stayed put, everything would be fine. What potential school shooter was going to check the bathroom? That said, I ran to the last stall, the one for people with wheelchairs, and scrambled up on the toilet. Should I lock the stall door? No, there was no point. If they did come in, it would be obvious that someone was in there. What if somehow they saw me through the small space in the door? Could I somehow wiggle on the ground from one stall to the next in an effort to evade them? By this point, I was slightly hysterical, but I knew, in the back of my mind, like you always know in these situations, if they did come in here, I would probably die. Ridiculously enough, I began preparing my last lines. What would I say? Should I try to plead with them? What if it was someone I knew? Maybe I could talk them down. But I couldn't even convince myself, never mind someone already homicidal. Should I try to be the hero and go for the gun? Right, and get shot in the face. Perhaps I could stall them. Stall them. I started to laugh. I didn't know why. Crouched on a grimy public high school toilet seat, my chuckles faded into harsh breathing, and I told myself not to look up, no matter what. I heard a loud noise from down the hall and flinched, although I had no idea what it was. I tried to still my breathing, and only succeeded in feeling faint. And then I heard it. Footsteps. I was sure of it. Maybe it was a cop, I told myself. The footsteps drew closer. I hadn't been raised to be religious, but right then and there, I started to make bargains. I didn't care if I got shot, as long as it didn't kill me, or paralyze me. Actually, that might be worse. I just wanted to go home. If whoever was in charge of this shit just made sure I got home, I would do whatever the hell they said for the rest of my life. Maybe they didn't have a gun. Maybe it was a knife. Maybe I could get out of this with a few nasty scars and a story. The bathroom door opened, and I went blank. I'm not sure how to describe it. I felt completely removed. I was there in the stall, but also, I wasn't. Like maybe it didn't really matter much either way, like I was beyond all of it. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I would collapse and die of fright. I knew they were there. I heard them. The first stall door swung open with a groan, as did the second. I tried to close my eyes, but I couldn't. My eyelids refused to cooperate. The third stall door opened. I was convinced I could hear them breathing. I wondered what they were thinking. Were they excited? Could they hear my breathing? God, I thought, don't let it be someone I know. The next stall opened, and the one after that was mine. Suddenly the loudspeakers crackled on. Lockdown is now complete. Students and staff, thank you for your cooperation. The person in the bathroom paused. They then turned and left, doors swinging quietly behind them. I didn't leave that stall for another 5 minutes. My first period teacher was very annoyed, but I didn't really care. I informed him about what happened, and he called the vice principal down, and I relayed my story to her. She seemed skeptical about my claim, and told me that the lockdown this morning was only a drill. The staff at the school was questioned, but no one had gone into the bathroom during the lockdown to check for students. I never really heard any more about it, but I'm certain that there had been someone in there with me, and they came very close to finding me.
One of the worst days of my life came right out of nowhere. I was working in my job at a local 7-Eleven, just burning away the daylight hours with no passion in life, no purpose, no nothing. Then suddenly, I feel this terrible headache coming on. I take a few painkillers, then got back to what I was doing. Some customer comes in, I ring them up for a coffee and a pack of donuts, and then that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital, and the nurses were prepping me for surgery. I was told I'd been diagnosed with a bleed in my brain and that the surgery would involve drilling a hole in my skull to drain the fluid. Then, just as they were about to put me under, the head of neurology got in touch with someone and called off the surgery completely. What actually happened is that I'd suffered an aneurysm, and according to my doctor, who told me this much later on, I would have probably been dead on the table just seconds after the surgery commenced. With a brain bleed, the solution is to drill holes in your skull, which relieves pressure and prevents your brain from swelling up and squeezing against your skull. If it does that, it can lead to some pretty serious brain damage, which is obviously very bad news. But in the case of an aneurysm, which is what is actually going on, that kind of surgery can prevent sufficient blood flow to your brain due to the sharp drop in blood pressure in your brain tissue. This then basically starves your brain of oxygen, leading to acute tissue death, which obviously just straight up kills you. That head of neurology legitimately saved my life that day, and the whole thing dramatically changed my outlook on life. A person can still feel perfectly healthy, perfectly normal, and then one little weak blood vessel in your brain and boom, it can all be over for them. Life is a terrifyingly fragile thing, one that can really just end at any moment. I quit my job at the 7-Eleven when I was recovering in the hospital, then asked my dad and mom if they could put me up in my old bedroom while I trained to be a comic book artist. They thought my choice of career was a little outlandish, and I don't blame them, but I think the shock of almost losing me to some random medical thing made them reevaluate a few things too. These days, I work as a full-time comic book artist, and although I don't make a ton of money, I feel like I'm actually living the life I want to, the one I was supposed to live, not one that's being dictated to me by my need for money or prestige or acceptance. I suppose I'm telling you all this because I hope everyone on Earth can live that way too, and it honestly breaks my heart that some people don't have a choice in the matter, because the idea that someone's life could just end while they were working some terrible retail job or doing just about anything they didn't want to do, I don't just find it heartbreaking, I find the concept utterly terrifying. Probably because I was just one surgery away from that exact same thing happening to me.
I used to work at a Chuck E. Cheese. I enjoyed the job a lot. It was a fun place to work, maybe because I had a lot of good memories of going there as a kid. I would do a little bit of everything there, including quite a bit of maintenance and cleaning. One night, I was working on a quieter evening. I was in the process of cleaning up a table area when I saw a customer approaching me. I stopped what I was doing and saw that there was a pretty average-looking guy standing in front of me. The guy told me that he had just been in the men's bathroom in the back, and he wanted to let me know that it was really dirty and could use a cleaning. I told the guy thanks for letting me know, and then he walked away. Keeping the bathroom clean was one of my jobs, and it wasn't one of my favorite parts of the job, but it actually usually wasn't that bad. After I was done clearing the table, I walked down the hallway to our little cleaning closet where I got a cleaning cart that I would use for the restrooms. By this time of night, the place wasn't too busy, and there were only a few kids and parents in the arcade or eating areas. When I got to the men's bathroom in the back, I went inside and saw that it was empty and nobody else was in, which was good. But when I looked around, everything seemed fine. I was happy to see this, but also confused. The more I looked around after going all around the bathroom, I saw that it was completely clean, and nothing was dirty at all. After that, I took my cart and went to leave. But when I tried opening the bathroom door to get out, it wouldn't move. All I had to do was push it open, but it seemed like there was someone or something on the other side blocking it and holding it back, because no matter how hard I pushed, it just wouldn't budge. I kept trying, but nothing was happening. Then suddenly, all the lights went out. It was pitch black in there, and I couldn't see a thing. I kept on trying the door, but nothing was happening. I started banging on the door and yelling at that point, hoping that somebody would hear me. Finally, after about a minute straight of this, the door suddenly burst open, and I went flying out there and fell flat on my face on the other side of the doorway. I looked around, but didn't see anybody nearby. I saw one of my coworkers, Jake, not too far away, kind of walking towards me. He came up and asked if I was okay, looking confused. I told him what had just happened to me. Jake said he had seen me go through the door, and he had heard somebody yelling, and that's why he was approaching the bathroom. He said when he got towards the bathroom doors, he saw a large man running away. I was really creeped out when I heard this. I actually looked around after that for the guy who had told me that the bathrooms were dirty, but I couldn't find him anywhere. I ended up just working the rest of the night like normal after that, but I've often wondered what exactly happened there.